Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
Jeffrey Rosenthal is a professor in the Department of Statistics at the University of Toronto. He received his BSc in Mathematics, Physics, and Computer Science from the University of Toronto at the age of 20, his PhD in Mathematics from Harvard University at the age of 24, and tenure in the Department of Statistics at the University of Toronto at the age of 29. And for his research, he was awarded the 2006 CRM SSC Prize and also the 2007 COPSS President's Award, the most prestigious honor bestowed by the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies. For his lecturing, he received a Harvard University Teaching Award in 1991 and an Arts and Science Outstanding Teaching Award at the University of Toronto in 1998. Rosenthal's book for the general public, Struck by Lightning, The Curious World of Probabilities, was a bestseller in Canada and is being published in a total of 15 countries and is available on Amazon.com. So please help me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Rosenthal.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So it's great for me to be here. I'm a member and supporter of the CFI, and it's great the way there are so many events and lectures and things that we can all participate in, and so I'm honored to be a part of it. And so I'm a professor of statistics, and I study probability and randomness, and some of my work is pretty technical and pretty mathematical, but this book that I wrote for the general public is about how probability and randomness, they're not just mathematical, technical subjects. They come up all the time in our everyday lives. So anything from, you're taking an airplane flight and you don't know if your airplane's going to crash, or you hear the terrorists might be on loose and what's the probability the terrorists are going to strike, or you're waiting for the bus and you don't know if the bus is going to be late. Or things like you hear about a poll that's accurate 19 times out of 20, and what does that mean? Or you hear about a medical study that says, they've proven that if you take this pill, then it'll make you better, and have they really proven that? Maybe you go to the casino and you're gambling and you don't know if you're going to make money or not. Maybe there's a strange coincidence. You run into somebody that you never thought you'd run into, and what are the odds of that, and what does that mean? Maybe you want to ask someone out on a date and you don't know if they're going to say yes or no. Anytime that you're not sure what's going to happen next, that's randomness, that's probability, that's uncertainty. And the point that I try to make in the book, and that I'll try to make tonight, is that without a lot of mathematics, just getting a bit of a perspective on how we should think about randomness, probability, uncertainty, and so on, can actually go a long way. It can help us to worry less about things that we don't really need to worry about, sometimes help us to make smarter decisions, and sometimes help us to understand the way the world works a little bit better. And since this is a secular humanist center, or free thought center, or inquiry center, I will make a few comments related to randomness and probabilities and the existence of God issues too at the end, but I won't emphasize that too much. But let me start off by, ever since I wrote this book and I've been in the media and so on, and people I study probabilities. The single thing that I get the most comments and questions and increase in the media about are lotteries. Somehow, whenever the lottery jackpot goes up a bit, I get a call. Someone wants a 10-second clip for the news about the probability of winning the lottery, right? Or more seriously, when you may have heard of, there was sort of a scandal involving the retailers in Ontario who had been winning more than they should have, and they were actually sometimes keeping tickets that should have gone to customers, winning tickets. And I was actually the consulting statistician for the CBC when they did that investigation, and I thought it was just one more little cute media project that I was doing a fair number of, but man, it was about the lotteries, and people thought they'd been ripped off, and it was front page news, and it was the lead story in the newspapers, and people really love their lotteries, right? So then you think, well, what can we say about lotteries from a probability point of view? Well, probably I don't have to tell you that the chance that you're going to win the lottery jackpot is not too big, right? But so what does that mean? So, well, something like the Lotto 649, the chance that you'll win the jackpot, that you'll match the numbers that they pick, is about one chance in 14 million, right? Or more precisely, one chance in 13,983,816, right? So a lot of people, they'll kind of know that, say, okay, but I still think I'm going to win, right? I still think I have a good chance. So then you say, well, how can you understand something like one chance in 14 million? Well, you can try to make comparisons. So for example, the chance that you'll win the jackpot with a single ticket is about the same as the chance if you choose an adult Canadian woman at random, the chance that she will give birth to a baby within the next minute and a half. That's not too likely, right? If you have to drive across town to the store in order to buy your lottery ticket, you're about twice as likely to die in an automobile accident on your way to the store as you are to win the jackpot. If you buy a lottery ticket once a week, on average, you'll win the big jackpot about once every 270,000 years. Not very often, right? So, it's fine if you enjoy the thrill of, buying a ticket and imagining what you might do with the money, but if you actually start seriously thinking that you're going to win, then you're just wrong, right? You're just not going to win. So then you say, well, I tell people this, and they say, well, you're kind of a killjoy, right? We were having all this fun buying lottery tickets, and now you've told us we're not going to win. But the reason I bring it up that way is because, in my opinion, there's a flip side, which is that there's a lot of bad things that we worry about, which are also extremely unlikely. And just like we're not going to win the lottery jackpot, these bad things aren't going to happen to us either. So let me set it up with a little story, a true story, that back when I was a graduate student, I once had to fly to New York City to visit my relatives. And I was flying into John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. And exactly 1 week before my flight, there was a major airplane crash at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. And 73 people died. And, I got a little scared, right? And I thought, maybe I should cancel my flight. Maybe I shouldn't fly to New York City. Maybe I should take a bus to New York City or walk to New York City. But, I shouldn't fly to New York City. And then I said, well, look, at the time I was working on my PhD in the probability theory. Maybe I can be a little smarter about this, right? So the first thing is, it's sort of a cliche, but it's also true that airplane travel is actually very safe. And for commercial flights, there's less than 1 chance in 5 million that a given flight is going to have an accident which involves fatalities. So just like you're not going to win the jackpot, your next commercial flight just isn't going to have an accident. It's just extremely unlikely. Now, when we hear about accidents, we think, they must happen more often. But of course, that's because there's millions and millions of flights every year. Occasionally, we hear about an accident. But the chance that your flight is going to have an accident is extremely small. If you really want to worry about something on your flight, well, there's about a 27% chance that it will be late. So that's something smart to worry about. But an accident's just not going to happen. But then you say, well, okay, that's good in general, but in this case, I was going to fly to John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, and there had been an accident there. So, maybe I should be more worried anyway. Well, one thing, I was scared, so I looked it up, and there's actually over 5,000 flights every week which just go into John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. And that's a lot, right? So what it means is even if I knew that there was going to be another accident at this same airport within the next week, there'd still only be about 1 chance in 5,000 that it would be my flight. Now that's not quite as small as, the chance of winning the lottery and so on, but it's still pretty darn small. So again, not something to worry about as much as you might think. But furthermore, there was no particular evidence that the airport had been at fault when this plane crashed. So what that meant was that didn't really make it any more or any less likely that my flight was going to crash, right? They're what we call independent events. It's a bit like that old joke about the guy who was afraid that the bad guys were going to bring a bomb onto the airplane he was on. And his solution was to bring his own bomb onto the airplane because he figured it was astronomically unlikely that there would be 2 different bombs on the same plane. And of course, that reasoning doesn't hold up, right? Because those are independent events, and whether you have a bomb doesn't make it any more or any less likely that the bad guys have a bomb. And just for the same reason, the fact that this flight had crashed didn't make it any more or less likely that my flight was going to crash. And I think we all kind of know these things, but it's hard to remember them when you're nervous about things. But in this case, I thought about it seriously, and I thought, okay, actually, there's nothing to worry about, and I flew to New York City, and I was fine. And so I've told this story sometimes to people, and they say, well, yeah, that's great, you got all your fancy numbers and statistics and arguments, but does that really help when you're worried about a plane crashing, or when you're up in the air and there's some turbulence and so on? And I say yes, it does, if you really stop and think about what it means, right? So if it's in one ear and out the other, then probability and randomness thoughts aren't going to help you very much. But if you really stop and think about just how unlikely it is that your airplane is going to crash, then you can stop worrying about it. And in my case, I used to be kind of a nervous flyer, and I'd always be looking out the window to make sure the wing was still attached, and that kind of thing. And then, I started thinking about it more rationally. I realized it's just not something that we should worry about, and now I don't worry about that. So that's one point I want to make, is that just by thinking a little bit about what are the probabilities involved can actually go a long way towards deciding what you should worry about or what you should think about. So it applies in lots of other cases, like let's say terrorist attacks. So let's take something like the 9/11 attacks, which were certainly horrific by any measure. They created a lot of anxiety, right? Sales of anxiety medication went way up in the time after the 9/11 attacks. A lot of people were worried. I personally know a couple who decided to get married then because they thought they better get married now while they had a chance. And a lot of people did things like that. And of course, it's understandable that people would feel that way. And you say, well, how can we put this in perspective? Use some sort of a mathematical or probabilistic way of thinking about something as horrible as the 9/11 attacks. Well, here's one perspective, that in the month of September 2001, when there were the 9/11 attacks, more Americans were killed in that very month in ordinary automobile accidents than were killed in the terrorist attacks. Now, what does that mean? Well, it certainly doesn't mean anything from a moral sense. There's no way to morally compare accidents to a deliberate act like that. But from a probability perspective, it actually does tell us something, right? It says that, if you were an American chosen at random in the United States in that month, you were less likely to be killed by the terrorists than you were to die in an ordinary automobile accident. So it kind of puts perspective, to my mind, on the probabilities. And in particular, it means because we don't go around taking anxiety medication because we might be killed in an automobile accident, because it's not that likely. For the same reason, maybe we shouldn't be as anxious as a lot of people were after the terrorist attack. And again, of course, that's different than having compassion for the victims or realizing it's a very serious event, but it's a way to put perspective on it. And this, again, comes up all over the place. So homicides are another thing that people get really scared about. And, I don't have to tell you that when there's homicides, they make the headlines. There's a lot of media comments and politicians and police and so on. So, for example, in the year 2005, some of you who were here then will remember that Toronto had a higher than usual number of homicides. And the summer of 2005 is now referred to by many people as the summer of the gun. You've probably heard that phrase, right? And in fact, that was just when I was working on the book and thinking about probabilities and randomness in everyday life and so on. And, so then you say, well, can we be rational about something like that? Can we think about the numbers and the probabilities and how they work? Well, in 2005, Toronto had a total of 80 homicides. That was up from the previous year when there were 64 homicides. So, was there an increase in homicides? Yes, there was, right? But then you say, well, was it, how bad was the increase and how can we understand it? Well, so it was about a 25% increase over the previous year, which, is something to think about. But, boy, did the media headlines come out, right? So, here's a few quotes from people at the time. So the media said that Toronto has lost its innocence. They said that guns were used to bathe Toronto in blood. The police chief at the time described the situation that that gun-crazed gangsters terrorized at will. One newspaper columnist summarized it as people were tripping over police tape and bullet-ridden bodies on their way to work. Okay, so a lot of talk, right? And then you say, well, what was the reality? So first of all, if you want to compare homicides or understand homicide rates and so on, one thing you have to do is you have to normalize by the population, which I think is sort of obvious, but people forget about that. So of course, in a big city, there's going to be more homicides just by average, but if you want to know the probability that you're going to be a victim, you have to take something like the number of homicides divided by the number of people. And it's usually phrased as the number of homicides per 100,000 people. So that's the homicide rate. And the Greater Toronto Area in 2005 had a homicide rate equal to 1.95 homicides for every 100,000 people. You say, well, is that a lot? Is that a little? Well, I probably don't have to tell you that it's less than a lot of American cities, right? So let's say New York City, which had this huge effort to reduce crime and to send all the criminals to New Jersey or whatever they did, and their 2005 homicide rate was 6.6, so it was over 3 times as much as Toronto. A more typical American city like Buffalo, the homicide rate in 2005 was 19.8, which is about 10 times what Toronto was in 2005. A city like Detroit, the murder capital, had a homicide rate of 39.5, which is about 20 times as high a rate on a per capita basis as Toronto in 2005, in the summer of the gun, right? Then you say, well, okay, but that's the Americans, right? What about Canadian cities? Well, in 2005, the city of Winnipeg had a homicide rate of 3.73, almost twice Toronto's. Edmonton was 4.26, over twice Toronto's. And Regina was 3.99, almost exactly twice Toronto's. In the year 2005, the summer of the gun, when we lost our innocence and all that, Canada overall in the year 2005 had a homicide rate of 2.05, slightly more than Toronto. So in the year 2005, the summer of the gun, when we lost our innocence, when we were bathed in blood, you had a slightly better chance of being the victim of homicide if you were chosen at random from the entire country as compared to being chosen at random within the city of Toronto. How many of the media headlines said that? None, right? The following year, 2006, Toronto's homicide count went back down to 69, more to traditional levels. How many headlines were there that said that we'd regained our innocence? That said that we were no longer bathed in blood? None, right? So there's sort of a headline bias that if there's a few more homicides than usual, it will get blown all out of proportion. If things return to normal levels, it won't be mentioned. And it leads to people getting the wrong impression, right? Because homicides make interesting news stories. They make the headlines. People think they're common. People think, oh, you're going to Toronto. It must be really dangerous there. Well, it's not. It's just wrong. So the numbers can tell you what's right and wrong. Another interesting perspective is the following fact, which is that in Canada, so happens that more people are murdered by their own spouse than are murdered by a complete stranger. So what does that mean? Well, it means, instead of worrying so much about who's hiding behind a tree in the park at night, maybe you should worry about who you choose to marry, right? Now, the real lesson, of course, is not that you should all be worried that your spouse is about to kill you, but rather that just like we don't worry every day that our spouse is about to kill us, maybe we shouldn't worry every day that a stranger is about to kill us too. So again, just a way to put things in perspective a little bit. And again, it's not to say it's not a serious issue, homicide and so on. It's just to say let's keep perspective on what the numbers are telling us. And it applies to a lot of other headline makers. Let's say if a child gets abducted, and that becomes front page news maybe for weeks or for months. Of course, it's a horrible story, but the reason it's making the headlines is because it's so rare, right? It's so rare that when it happens, we all get interested and it's something to talk about. Whereas if a guy dies of a heart attack, that usually doesn't make the headlines, right? And it's much, much more common. In fact, over a third of Canadians will eventually die from cardiovascular disease, from heart attacks and strokes and so on. And interestingly, one of the risk factors of cardiovascular disease is stress and worry, right? So it's probably true, I don't quite know how to prove this, but it's probably true that more people die from the extra stress of worrying about things like terrorist attacks and airplane crashes than actually die because of those things. So again, it's a way to get a little perspective. So this sort of idea of getting perspective or thinking in terms of the probabilities and the numbers and so on, it comes up in a lot of other ways too. And here's another true story from me. This is back when I was 26 years old. I was young and healthy, a long, long time ago, right? And I went for a routine medical exam, and they did a thorough exam, and they were testing all kinds of things, and they sent my blood for all kinds of tests. And a few days later, I got a letter in the mail, and it said, "Oh, dear Mr. Rosenthal, the test for lupus has come back positive." Now, lupus is a pretty serious disease, as I'm sure you'll know, and if you're a young, healthy person in your mid-20s and you get a letter like this, it's actually pretty devastating, I can assure you. And they said, well, we can do a more accurate test, a DNA-based test, to see if you really have it, because they said about 5% of the normal population will actually test positive for this disease. But, I'm going to have to book another appointment, they're going to have to do another test, they're going to have to send it away to a lab, it's going to take a couple of weeks. So for a couple of weeks, I have to deal with this letter that says, "Dear Mr. Rosenthal, the test for lupus came back positive." And then you think, okay, well, let's see, what can we think about? Well, they said about 5% of the normal population will test positive. That doesn't sound that helpful, right? It sounds like that must mean there's a 95% chance that I've really got lupus, right? But then you say, well, okay, at the time I was a young professor of probability theory. Surely I can do better than that, right? So you think, okay, well, how can you think about this? Well, I looked it up, and slightly less than 1% of the population will eventually get lupus. So what does that mean? So that means that the people who test positive for this test, they're either part of the slightly less than 1% of the population which actually has lupus, or they're part of the 5% of the population which is healthy but which is going to test positive for lupus anyway. So the fact that I got a positive test meant I was part of the 6% of society which will test positive for this test, and only 1% out of that 6% are people who actually have lupus. So when I got this positive test, if you think about it, my chance of having lupus wasn't 95%, it was actually 1 chance in 6, or 1% divided by 6%, or about 17% chance, which is still higher than I would have liked, right? It's not so good, but it's not so bad either, and it was enough to get me, okay, I can calm down, I probably don't have lupus, let's wait for that test, and then finally I got the follow-up test, and I did not have lupus, so I could finally relax, but I think without that little probability calculation, I kind of would have gone crazy there, right? And then you say, well, I've told people this story, and they say, why didn't that letter from the doctor, that one that said you tested positive for lupus, but 5% of the normal population has it, why didn't it tell you you only had 1 chance in 6 of having lupus? Well, it's a good question, right? So, I think part of the reason is that, well, the medical profession is not particularly oriented towards alleviating anxiety, right? That's not the way they tend to be oriented. It's probably not the first thing they think about. But then also, I'm not sure if the doctor could have done that calculation, right? I mean, it's not a hard calculation, but you have to just think about things right in terms of what we call conditional probability. That is, you get something like a positive test, and how should that change your probabilities? And most of us don't think that way most of the time. So maybe it wasn't obvious to the doctor either, I don't know. But anyway, so then you say, okay, when you get a positive test, think about what it means. Or when you get any information, just think about just a little bit what it means in terms of the probabilities. Doesn't mean you have to do a lot of math, you just have to think about it a bit. So then you say, well, what if you're, let's say, trying to assess evidence? So to take a particular example, let's suppose your friend says, hey, I can tell the difference by taste. I can distinguish between Coke and Pepsi. Okay? Somebody finds that very amusing. Your sister can? Well, there you go. So if her sister comes in, right? Her sister comes in and says, hey, I can distinguish between Coke and Pepsi. And you say, well, maybe you say, who cares? I don't really care if it's Coke or Pepsi, but maybe you say, well, that's interesting. Let's see if we can tell if this claim is true or not. How do you tell if a claim is true? Well, you set up a test, right? So for a case like that, you'd probably set up a test where you'd get a bunch of glasses, and you'd fill some of them with Coke and some of them with Pepsi, randomly 50-50 each time, but you'd keep track of which is which. And then you get her sister or whoever your friend is to come in and say, okay, well, we want you to taste this first glass and tell us if it's Coke or Pepsi. So suppose the friend or the sister comes in, tastes the first one, says, oh, that's Coke, and they're right. Well, does that mean they've proven that they can tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi? Well, maybe not, right? Because maybe they got lucky, right? Then you say, okay, well, let's do the second glass. They take a sip of that one, and they get it right, too. Now they've gotten it right twice in a row. Does that mean they've proven they can tell a Coke from Pepsi? Well, maybe, or maybe they got lucky, right? Okay, you give them a third glass. What if they got that one right, too? They're 3 for 3. Have they proven they can tell a Coke from Pepsi? I don't know. And if you think, well, this is not a very important example, well, let me give you another example, which the probabilities are just the same thing, which is, suppose there's a horrible disease which kills half the people who get it. It's got a 50% fatality rate. And then a drug company comes along and says, we have this new drug. If you get this disease, but you take our drug, then you'll always survive. And they give that drug to the first patient who has this horrible disease, and the patient survives. Does that prove that the drug worked? What if they give it to 2 patients and they both survive? Does that prove the drug worked? What if they give it to 3 patients and they all survive? Does that prove the drug worked? So you can say, well, either how many patients have to survive before they've proven the drug works, or how many times does her sister have to tell us whether it's Coke or Pepsi before we believe that she's got that talent? And if you're even thinking about that issue, then you're all statisticians. That's what statisticians do, right? The question is, we get some evidence, but there's randomness involved or there's uncertainty involved, and we have to make conclusions. We have to decide whether there's enough evidence to prove something or there isn't. So there's different ways to think about this, but one standard way is what's called the p-value. So p just stands for probability, and the p-value means what's the chance that it would have happened by luck alone, basically. So if we go back to the Coke and Pepsi, well, if her sister gets it right once, well, they had a 50-50 chance of getting it right just by luck if they didn't have any abilities at all, right? So we'd say the p-value is equal to 50% because they got it right once. What if they get it right twice in a row? Well, the chance they would have gotten that by luck alone is equal to 50% of 50%, or 25%, right? Or 1 chance in 4. So you say, okay, if you get it right twice, the p-value is now down to 25%. What if you get it right 3 times in a row? Well, then the chance of that happening by luck alone, the p-value, is a half times a half times a half, which is 1/8, or 12.5%. So as you get more and more evidence, the p-value gets smaller and smaller. And instead of saying how much evidence do you need, we could say how small does the p-value have to be? How small does it have to be the probability that it happened by chance alone? How small does that have to be before we say, okay, you've proven it? Now, you might think, well, the p-value should be 0. We should have to be absolutely certain before we say a drug works. But of course, you're never going to be absolutely certain. So the question is, how much uncertainty can you have? Or how large can the p-value be? And you still say you've proven it. Now, there's a standard which is pretty widely accepted in medical sciences and in a bunch of other sciences too, which is the 5% standard, or the 1 chance in 20, as you may know. And it says if the p-value is as small as 5% or less, if it's under 5%, then, okay, then we've proven it. So in the case of the Coke versus Pepsi, if you got it right 5 times in a row, the probability of that happening by luck alone is a half times a half times a half times a half times a half, which is 1 chance in 32, which is about 3.1%, which is less than 5%. So by the standards of medical science, if her sister can guess right 5 times in a row, we'd have to say, okay, you've proven it. You can tell Coke versus Pepsi. Or more importantly, if the drug company saves 5 patients in a row, which normally each patient had a 50% chance of dying, we'd say, okay, the p-value is equal to 3.1%, so your drug must be working better. Okay. So, it's not a bad standard, but right away it maybe gets you thinking. And in particular, it could mean that as many as 1 medical study in 20 happened just by luck, right? And actually didn't prove anything. The drug didn't make any difference. It just happened just by luck that they got a good result. So, the next time you go to your doctor's office and the doctor says, hey, we have studies that prove you better take this pill, and if you don't take it, you're going to die. You say, well, that's great, doc, but what's the p-value of that study? What's the probability that that was just chance alone and actually didn't prove anything at all? And, some people think the p-value should have to be smaller than 5%. Maybe it should have to be 1% or less before you're really convinced of things. So that's one thing to think about with medical testing. There's a related issue, which is, let's go back, I guess, to the Coke and Pepsi. And let's suppose, her sister comes and maybe she doesn't get it right at first, but she's just warming up, and she works at it all afternoon doing tests of Coke and Pepsi at random. And finally, after a few hours, she gets it right 5 times in a row. Then she says, look, I got it right 5 times in a row, and you said the standards of medical science say that proves that I can tell Coke from Pepsi. Well, we'd say, no, you didn't prove anything because you didn't just get it right 5 times in a row. You were working at it all afternoon, and just the fact that you're only counting those last 5, that doesn't prove anything. You have to count the whole history. So now, that might seem kind of like a silly thing, but from the point of view of the pharmaceutical companies and so on, if a drug company is able to commission a whole bunch of studies and say, well, the ones that come back and show that our drug doesn't work so well, maybe we're not going to let those ones be published, or we're going to hide them, we're going to suppress them. But the one study that shows that our drug works well, that's the one we're going to publish, and that's the one we're going to advertise and so on. Well, if they're able to do that, then that's bad, right? Because then they can pretty much prove anything they want, and the study could have been done by a respectable researcher and so on, and it could have a p-value which is nice and small and so on, but it really wouldn't prove anything because we don't know the whole history. So, in particular, the next time, your doctor tells you a study's proved, you better take this medicine or you better do this exercise and so on, you've already told them, you've already asked them what's the p-value of that study, and maybe they didn't know that, so that's already bad. And then you say, well, what other studies have been done on the same question or the same topic or the same drug? And if there have been other previous studies, but those ones didn't prove the same thing, well, then you should still be skeptical because you need to take into account all the evidence that's involved. And in particular, if a drug company is able to only publish the studies which make them look good, well, we'll call that a publication bias, right? And we'll say, well, if you're just getting those studies, then you're getting a biased perspective. And that's more and more of an issue in the medical sciences, and there's more and more rules that are being put in place by the medical journals, which says things like, if you commission a study, then the person running the study has to have the right to publish it, whether it makes you look good or not. And that's important, and a lot of medical journals have done that. They've also set up repositories where you have to announce the study when you're starting it, so that the study becomes part of the records, whether it makes the company look good or not. So those kind of things are really important from the probability point of view. And this issue of biases, I want to talk a little more about this issue of just like if you only publish the studies that make you look good, that's a bias. Well, once you start thinking about biases, you realize they come up sort of all over the place, not just in medical studies, but everywhere in life. So some of them are kind of obvious, but even then we don't always think about so much. So let's say like a movie advertisement, and there's a quote in the advertisement. It says, wonderful plot, extremely funny, and got the name of some reviewer and some radio station or something underneath it, right? Well, I probably don't have to convince you that the people making up the advertisements are only going to select the ads which make them sound good, and they're only going to take quotes from reviews that make them sound good. And if you think about it, virtually any movie, no matter how terrible it is, there's some little community newsletter in Arizona somewhere that said it was good, right? And if they can find that and quote that, then they'll say it. So what does that mean? It means that it's not just that if you see a quote of a positive review, you should take that with a grain of salt because maybe not all reviewers agreed. It's sort of more than that. It's sort of saying that that quote on the ad actually is meaningless, right? It doesn't tell you anything at all because there's always going to be some positive review. That's such a biased sample that it doesn't tell you anything. Whereas if you choose in advance certain reviewers that you trust, and you say, okay, whatever they say, I'm going to think that's a good movie, then that's not biased. But the minute you say, I'm going to let the advertiser choose which reviews I hear, it's so biased as to be completely meaningless. So, that's kind of obvious, but some biases aren't quite as obvious. Which ones I should say? Well, okay, so here's a survey that was conducted a little while back, and they asked the following question. They said, which medium do you rely on most in order to keep abreast of the news? Okay, and it was multiple choice, right? So you could say, oh, you use mostly the newspaper or television or radio and so on. Or you could say internet. And this survey found that 62% of the respondents actually said the internet. Okay, so then you think, well, what does that prove? Does it prove that, computers are being used so much that, everyone's getting their information that way and things can change so quickly? Well, what if I told you that the survey was conducted on the website globeandmail.com? Then, of course, you can probably see that it's by a sample, right? Because the only people who are visiting that website are already getting some of their news on the web. And in fact, the only really interesting thing is that the figure isn't even higher, right? That it's not almost everybody on the site just getting their news primarily on the internet. Here's one. So when I was younger, I played some basketball sometimes. And I'm proud to say that in basketball practice, considering only my last shot of the day before the end of practice, I was a 100% shooter. So you might think, okay, that sounds pretty good, right? Then you think, well, it's actually not hard to set up, right? We kind of had a tradition that, when the practice was coming to an end, we'd take a shot. If it went in, we'd go home. If it missed, we'd shoot again, right? And shoot again, and finally it would go in, and then we could go home. So it's not hard to be a 100% shooter on your last shot of the day. And we call that a stopping bias, right? Because we kind of get to decide when the experiment's over. And if you get to decide when the experiment's over, well, you can end it on a note that makes you look good. It's a bit like, that old saying that when you lose something, you always find it in the last place you look, right? Because once you find it, you stop looking, right? The experiment's over. Of course you find it in the last place that you look. Let's... okay, maybe... let me say, I'll say this one. This is there's issues of sort of observational bias. And this comes from, I had a friend from grad school that we kept in touch after grad school, and we used to write letters to each other. And we had some disagreements. She was a little more conservative than I was. And in particular, one thing we disagreed about was the extent to which gender differences are sort of inherent. That is, she kind of thought, boys are born a certain way and girls are born a certain other way, and that's just the way it is. And I thought more that, any child can sort of, could, let's say, be good or bad at anything depending on their environment and so on. And it's a complicated debate, and, we're not going to solve it tonight. But anyway, one time she wrote me a letter, and she said she'd had a son. I knew she'd had a son, so now she had some evidence, right? And she said, I had a son, and, I have to tell you, my son is obsessed with trucks. Just from an early age, he just loved to play with trucks. And, you think there's no inherent gender differences, but, my son just loved trucks. And, what do you have to say to that? And she said, and in fact, we're actually really glad and relieved that he loves trucks so much. Otherwise, we'd be more concerned by the fact that he loves flowers. Say, well, wait a minute. So this is someone who loves one thing that's kind of stereotypically boy, the trucks, and one thing that's stereotypical girl, the flowers. That's 50-50, right? And in fact, if anything, that shows that, different children could love different things. It doesn't necessarily follow gender stereotypes. But to this friend, the trucks proved her point, and the flowers were an aberration. So as long as you remember the bits of evidence that will support your point, then you can support anything that you want. And that's why most arguments, be they political or philosophical, they don't actually end with anyone convincing anyone else, right? Everyone kind of remembers their own points. Let me mention one more example of biases, and this one's maybe a little more subtle if you haven't heard the story before, and you may have heard it. So it goes back to the Second World War, and it was the U.S. Air Force was examining their airplanes that were coming back from battle in Europe, and they noticed a lot of them were being shot at, and some of them were being shot down. And they wanted to reinforce the outer hull of the airplanes in order to make them more resistant to bullets. But they couldn't reinforce the entire plane or else it would be too heavy and it couldn't fly. So they had a question. They said, which parts of the plane should we reinforce? And they had all sorts of charts and diagrams because the planes that came back, they could look on the hull and see where the bullets had hit. And they had charts and diagrams of where the different bullets had hit on the different planes. And then they had to decide where to reinforce them. And they did the smartest thing in the world. They asked a statistician, right? So there was a statistician named Abraham Wald working in the United States. And they said, look, we've got all these charts and diagrams. Where should we reinforce the hull? And Abraham Wald, he said, you should reinforce the hull in the places where you're not finding any bullet holes. You think, well, wait a minute. That doesn't sound right? The places where they're not shooting at the planes, why would we want to reinforce those parts? And, well, Abraham Wald said it's because you've got a biased sample. You're only seeing the planes which have come back from battle. Right? And the ones that were shot in those other places, those are the ones that went down, that didn't come back. And sure enough, those were the parts of the plane that were the most vulnerable, that were near the cockpit and near the fuel tank and so on. And sure, they didn't get any planes coming back with bullet holes there because the ones that were shot there had actually gone down. So kind of a subtle example of a sampling bias, that you only get to see the planes that come back from battle, and it can give you the wrong impression. So as soon as you start thinking about, biases and how the information you get might not be the whole story, it comes up all over the place. I'm talking about things related to statistical evidence and so on. And as I say, this is the Center for Inquiry, and one thing that comes up are issues of, a divine intervention and the existence of God and so on. And so I don't normally talk about this, but let me say just a few sort of thoughts about that. So I guess I first thought about this when I had a little conversation with a friend or more of an acquaintance, and she said, I heard that you don't believe in divine intervention. And, normally I don't go around telling everybody about that, but I guess I was in the media and so on, so people hear different things about me. And so she says, you don't believe in divine intervention. Well, I beg to differ. Okay. And, I didn't want to get into a big argument or whatever, so I just sort of, weakly quiet said, well, I just don't really think there's any evidence for it. Ha, ha, ha. She said, well, there's no evidence against it either. And, I just kind of tried to change the subject at that point, right? But then later I think about, okay, so, you can try to think about, is there evidence for or against divine intervention? So she would say there's no evidence, I guess, and we just have to decide on the basis of faith. Now, of course, questions like this are never really going to be decided by logical arguments. We don't tend to convince each other, but since I'm mostly among friends here tonight, let's what can we say to think about it? So, of course, many people who, let's say, are religious will notice all the sort of wonderful and incredible things in our world, right? Everything from advanced, intelligent humans and other animals. Well, at least some of us are intelligent, right? But so there's advanced species, and then certainly there's food and water for us, and all sorts of wonderful scenery and wonderful environments for us to live in, there's also a lot of bad things, right? There's children who get cancer, and there's earthquakes, and there's floods, and there's tsunamis that kill lots of people and so on. And also from the point of view of society, well, often good triumphs and things are handled in a way that's fair and just. And often it doesn't, and there's horrible wars, and there's holocausts, and there's all sorts of destruction too. So, to my mind, that's already saying, well, that's kind of consistent with a universe that doesn't have an all-powerful moral force that makes sure that only good can happen. It's more of a universe where things happen according to random laws. And, yes, a lot of good things happen, but a lot of bad things happen too. And, you say, well, okay, so the way the world works is, to my mind, not consistent with the existence of an all-powerful, all-good divine intervention. And then, of course, you say, well, if the evidence is not consistent with that, then why should we believe such an outlandish theory, right? And so, of course, religious people, as probably many of you will know, will reply in various ways in this kind of discussion. And a lot of the arguments are pretty much boiled down to, look, God works in mysterious ways, right? And, that's sort of the end of the conversation, right? Sort of saying, look, we humans are not smart enough to figure out what's going on. We just have to accept this on faith. There's no point even discussing it. And of course, if that's what you believe, well, then I just won't discuss it, right? But then you say, well, okay, people will say other things. Of course, they'll say things like, well, there is a lot of moral enforcement, but it all comes after we die, in the afterlife. And of course, there's no way to measure that scientifically or to observe it. So that's another way that we can't really discuss it. There's also the belief that, that God does not have a divine intervention in this life because he wants to test us, right? He wants to test us with our free will and so on. And I don't know, I always found that a bit of a strange, I guess as a professor, I'm a professor at the university, and, I give tests to my students, right? And different kinds of tests, and some of them are easy, and some of them are hard, and some of them are straightforward, and some of them are kind of tricky, but I never give them a test without telling them it's a test, right? So somehow the idea is all a test, and by the way, the hardest part of the test is to figure out that it is a test, right? So I don't find that so convincing, but nonetheless, if that, for some reason you believe that, then, I guess, again, there's nothing to say, because if God's not intervening, then there's nothing to say. There's also, of course, people will say, well, God does intervene, and in fact, the world is moral. It's just not obvious that it is. So let's say the tsunami of December 2004 that killed 230,000 people in a matter of hours. Well, that was just, because I guess those 230,000 people who were near the beach all happened to be evil people who deserved to die, right? Doesn't seem very likely, right? Because you imagine God trying to set this up, right? And saying, well, wait, there's one evil guy there. Okay, just go a little closer to the beach. But, you nice guys, you move away from the beach now, right? And setting it up so 230,000 people will all be the evil ones, and everybody else's inland won't be as evil. So, that sort of seems implausible. But nonetheless, some people will say, including this friend that I had my little debate with, will say, well, there actually is evidence, because if there's no evidence or the universe is not consistent with the moral force, then I would argue we shouldn't believe it. But they'll say, no, if you look carefully, there actually is evidence. And so that's what I thought I'd just think a little bit about, is there actually evidence for divine intervention? Of course, I don't think there is, but people do think there is sometimes. And what can we say about that? Well, so, typical evidence, someone might say something like, a story, let's say, we were at war and a bomb went off in the building I was in and there were 10 of us there and the other 9 people were killed instantly, but I was thrown clear, and obviously God was helping me, right? Well, what about those 9 other people, right? And, to my mind, if there's 10 people in a building and one of them's thrown clear and 9 of them are killed, that's not very effective divine intervention, right? That's not actually saving the majority of the innocent people. So to me, that's actually evidence against divine intervention. Similarly, the actual conversation with my friend that started her, questioning my lack of belief in divine intervention, she said, oh yeah, well, you don't believe in divine intervention. Well, listen to this, buddy, So she said she had a diamond ring that she showed me. It was, I guess her engagement ring from her husband, a very precious thing. She was driving in her car, and she suddenly looked, and the diamond was gone. The diamond had fallen off of her ring. And she prayed and prayed that the ring would come back. And later she got up, and she felt in her pocket, and sure enough, the little diamond had fallen. It was in her pocket, right? And to her mind, this was evidence of divine intervention, right? You think, well, okay, so we're supposed to believe that, God in his infinite wisdom decided that your diamond should fall off the ring, first of all, right, for some reason. maybe punishing you, or maybe the work of the devil, she said, or some such thing. And then, nonetheless, because he prayed well enough, decided that it should come back in your pocket, right? So, okay, so is that really evidence, right? Well, first of all, again, if you do believe that that kind of thing is evidence, then in particular, it should be that if you're a good moral person, as she presumably was, every time you lose something important, you should always find it again, right? Most of us, we lose important things now and again. Sometimes we find it and sometimes we don't. Right? So again, it seems to me that anything where you're trying to claim an evidence like that, it should be happening consistently. And from the point of view of probability theory or statistics, you want to say, well, what's the evidence for and against? And if sometimes you lose things and sometimes you get them back and sometimes you don't, that's evidence of randomness or uncertainty. That's not evidence of intervention. But then, some people will take other evidence that, to my mind, kind of borders on the absurd, but it'll convince people. So there's things like, here's one sort of absurd example that you probably heard, and there's been a few cases like this, but in particular in 2004, there was somebody who claimed that they'd made a grilled cheese sandwich, and the image of the Virgin Mary had appeared in their grilled cheese sandwich. Right? And this was therefore a form of divine intervention. This was, a sign from God. This grilled cheese sandwich was sold on eBay for $28,000. So people take this seriously, right? So then you say, okay, well, let's take this seriously for 1 second. Let's say, suppose we decided, God in his infinite wisdom has decided that for the most part, he's not going to reveal himself. For the most part, he's not going to intervene. But every once in a while, he's going to make these little bits of evidence for us. And he's decided that the most efficient way to do this is by appearing in a grilled cheese sandwich, right? Okay, so, it seems implausible to me, but let's just take that as our hypothesis. Well, then you say, what is the grilled cheese sandwich evidence for or against God? And the answer is there have been hundreds of millions of grilled cheese sandwiches that have been made. Almost all of them have not, by anyone's interpretation, had an image of God in them, right? Or an image of the Virgin Mary in them. So, to my mind, that's overwhelming evidence against the hypothesis that God, in his infinite wisdom, has chosen to reveal himself to us in grilled cheese sandwiches, right? Now, I realize most people here wouldn't take seriously the evidence from a grilled cheese sandwich anyway, but nonetheless, to my mind, the very things that are often cited as evidence for God are actually evidence for a lack of intervention by God anyway. So, and I always end up getting reminded of the comments from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right, where the babblefish, some of you may know, is this incredibly useful little fish. So you put it in your ear, and you could immediately understand all different languages, and it was like the universal translator. And someone wrote a book saying this was such an incredibly useful thing that it proved the non-existence of God, because it was such an obvious example of divine intervention. But we all know that God demands faith, so God couldn't possibly have done it, so there couldn't be a God. So just gets more and more twisted, right? This idea that there's a God, but he doesn't reveal himself, but sometimes there's little evidence and sometimes there isn't. Anyway, I think, of course, the reality is that people decide these things on other grounds, on the basis of what they need or don't need to feel satisfied in their life or to believe in a worldview. And it's not really decided in terms of the evidence. But when people do claim that there's actual evidence for God, I think it's interesting to think about it a bit. And to my mind, it's really, really not. So. Anyway, so I want to not go on too much longer, but let me tell you what. Let me talk about one more thing, which is about surprising coincidences, because they come up a lot, and it's another thing that people often will think they have a special meaning, or they have some maybe evidence of divine intervention, or maybe just evidence of the forces of cosmos or synchronicity or hidden meaning or fate and so on. So then you say, well, what can we say about strange and surprising coincidences? So let me again talk about a story of my own. When I was 14 years old, I'm going back even further into my past now, my family went on a trip to Disney World in Florida, and we spent a couple of days going on rides and waiting in lines and all the things you do when you go to Disney World in Florida. And at one point, right in the middle of it all, we look up, and who do we see but my father's cousin, Phil. Now, Phil lives in Connecticut. He had no idea we were going to be in Florida. We had no idea he was going to be in Florida. We certainly hadn't communicated about it. And yet suddenly there he was, my dad's cousin Phil. And you say, wow, it's incredible, right? And at the time there were about 230 million people in the United States. So you say, well, what are the odds? It sounds like there's 1 chance in 230 million that this guy in front of me will be my dad's cousin Phil. You think that's so unlikely, it's even less likely than winning the lottery or all these things. It must prove something magical, right? And maybe I have to spend the rest of my life following my dad's cousin Phil and doing whatever he says, and we were meant to be together, right? And then you think, well, how can you think about that kind of rationally, right? As a probabilist. And well, so, it's true that if you say, what's the odds that this one person right in front of me is going to specifically be my dad's cousin Phil out of all the people in the United States at that time? Indeed, it's 1 chance in 230 million. But then you say, is that really the right question that we should be asking? And then you say, well, okay, we went to Disney World for a couple of days. We went on lots of rides and lines and whatever. We didn't just see one person while we were there, right? In fact, on the contrary, we saw lots of people. And then you think, well, how many people did we see at, let's say, close enough range that if they had been my dad's cousin Phil, we would have recognized them? Well, probably a couple of thousand, right? When you think about it, if a couple of days being on rides, you actually walk past or see or spot a couple of thousand people. So right away you say, well, the chance that we would run into my dad's cousin Phil on this trip is not just 1 chance in 230 million. There's actually a couple of thousand chances out of 230 million that one of the people we saw would be my dad's cousin Phil. Then you say, okay, so that brings the odds to something like 1 chance in 100,000 or something. That's still really unlikely, right? So it still must really mean something. But then you say, well, my dad's cousin Phil wasn't the only person that we would have been surprised to see. Right? What about my dad's other cousin? Or my mom's cousin, right? Or my cousin? Or what about my friend from elementary school? Or what about our next door neighbor? Or what about the person that we met on another vacation? Or you start realizing all the people that if you saw them, you'd recognize them and you'd be incredibly surprised. What are the odds that you're doing here? That's hundreds of people, actually. I estimated something like 500 people, roughly speaking, that if you saw them when you went to Disney World, you'd say, it's incredible, it's amazing. What are the chances I'd see you here? So then you say the chance that you're going to run into somebody who's really surprising over the course of a couple of days at Disney World is actually a couple of thousand chances times about 500 or so different people that you might run into, divided by 230 million, right? And when you work that all out, it works out to something like half of 1%, roughly speaking. So what does that mean? It means, roughly speaking, you have about 1 chance in 200, if you spend a couple of days at a place like Disney World, of running into somebody that you'll be completely surprised and amazed to see there. Now, that's still pretty small, right? 1 chance in 200, but it's not so small. It's not astronomically small anymore. And then you say, over a lifetime of, going on different trips and seeing different people and being different places where there's people that you wouldn't expect to meet there and so on, it starts to be reasonably likely, or at least not unlikely, that at some point you will run into somebody completely unexpectedly in a place where you least expect to see them. And in fact, maybe if you don't mind, I'll ask by a show of hands, everyone just think about whether you have some story in your life where you ran into someone completely unexpectedly in a place you never expected to see them and you found it completely surprising. Who would say, yeah, I got some story like that? See, quite a few, right? Probably at least half, maybe a little more than half. And that's sort of what I figured, that over a lifetime, there's something like about a 50% chance that something like that will happen. So if you think about it that way, well, it doesn't mean that it's not amazing when it happens. It doesn't mean it's not exciting and you probably go for lunch and you talk about how incredible it is that you're both in the same place. But, it doesn't mean that it's something that's, astronomical or something that you would never expect to see or something that indicates that there's some intervention or a moral code or your lucky charm or whatever it is that made this happen. These things will just tend to happen by chance every now and then. So it's a way to think in terms of probabilities and randomness and get some perspective on things. So anyway, there's lots more things I could talk about, but I think I shouldn't keep you too long. Also, we will take questions afterwards. But let me just kind of wrap up by saying that, if there's any one point that I'm hoping to make today or that I'm hoping to make in the book is that, probability, randomness, and uncertainty, they're with us everywhere. It's not like, if you plan your life really well, then you'll never have anything random, right? There's always going to be things that are unexpected, things that you can't predict, things that you have to make your best guess about. And to my mind, just thinking rationally about them just a little bit, not a super lot of mathematics. You don't need to get a PhD in probability theory, right? But you just need to think a little bit about, okay, what are the real numbers here? What are the effective probabilities that we want to compute? How do probabilities work together? What about conditional probabilities and so on? And you start to realize certain things are really unlikely and we shouldn't worry about them or hope for them. Certain things, may not be the way that they first appear in the headlines and so on. And certain things may have meanings which are somewhat different than they sound like at first. And things we hear about, whether it's a medical study or an election poll or anything else, we have to think about what it really means and what it doesn't mean. So anyway, I call that the probability perspective, sort of thinking about things from the point of view of logic and probability, let's say. So anyway, I'm happy to take questions, but I think I'll end there. And again, thank you very much.
What's your opinion about the quality of probability evidence that is presented generally in court? Also, by the way, if you had a negative test result in your lupus test, how would you have felt about a false negative?
I see. You mean if the test had come back negative, then maybe I still could have lupus. So that's true. Yeah, I mean, there's false positives and there's false negatives, and they could both be serious. I guess since I was happy being a 25-year-old, I would have preferred a false negative to the truth, I think. I'm not sure. But in any case, yeah, certainly tests have both false positives and false negatives that you have to think about. But in regards to your first question, yeah, evidence in court is actually quite interesting because, in probability, we try to have certain standards for statistical evidence. We say, the p-value should be less than 5% or less than 1%. In courts, they have their own standards of evidence, right? They say it should be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, or should be proven on a balance of probabilities. And they say, what's the p-value that corresponds to? Or what's the probability that corresponds to? And actually no one knows, right? There's no standard, and in fact, the judges and so on are resistant to having a standard, saying, as long as there's at least a 97% chance that the guy committed murder, he has to go to jail. There's no standard like that, and so judges and juries have to decide whether it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and really no one knows what reasonable doubt is, and often, as you'll certainly know, there are expert witnesses on different sides, and there's evidence presented, and sometimes the evidence does include a statistical or a probability component. But often, the real question is, well, is that guy telling the truth about the evidence, or was the evidence tampered with, or he says he got that blood at the scene of the crime, did he really get it at the scene of the crime? And those things are hard to quantify. So the reality is that probability statistics certainly plays a role in the way courts deliberate, but it's a very subtle role, and there's no simple, it'd be great if there was a 97% standard for murder and a 94% chance standard for drunk driving and so on, but there just isn't. So it's a hard thing, and some people think there should be, but some people think no, there shouldn't be, because it's not just a question of probabilities, it's the judgment of the jury, do they really trust the guy, and so on. So it's a hard issue anyway, so I'll leave it at that. So.
I was wondering, they just made charge somebody from Goldman Sachs. What I was kind of wondering about is, they used to talk about quants specialists were going to save the financial system and everything, and that turned out bad. And Lewis wrote the book The Big Short, in which all these big firms, Wall Street firms, were making all these bets on all the wrong things. What's the probability that they're ever going to figure out what these quant guys did wrong? And do you think they'll ever find out who really got the money?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good issues there. I mean, certainly, as most of you will know, more and more of the financial world is governed by these probability and statistical models, and option pricing and hedging and all these complicated things. And it's certainly all based on mathematical models, some of which are pretty complicated. And some people say, well, when there's a big crash, that proves that the mathematical models were wrong, right? Well, to my mind, a mathematical model can't really be wrong or right. It's a question of how it's used and how it's applied, and no mathematics ever completely describes the real world. So, to my mind, the issue really is not whether the models are wrong or right, but how they're used. In fact, I went to a talk last night by Robert Merton, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, which was interesting, and one of the points he made, he said, it's not that people want to just blame certain quants, but actually he says in order to recover the world financial system, it's not that we're going to need fewer quants involved. He says we're going to need more, right? We need more people with expertise, and the problem is when people actually don't have sufficient expertise, or they just take into account one part of the problem, or they don't take into account all the risks and all the uncertainties. And I guess part of his point was that often the people really making the decisions of whether it's too risky to hold certain holdings if you're a bank and so on are maybe not the quantitative experts. They're the bank managers or the overseers and so on. So his feeling was we actually need more expertise there, but it is a big, complicated system. And I guess I won't say anything simple. I can't remember the exact question. I guess was, what's the probability we're going to figure out who took the money? And I mean, a lot is known, but it's also true that to some extent they're proceeding with new regulations without necessarily knowing exactly what went wrong and without having all the data and all the analysis in. And in fact, some people say that it'd be better to wait a few years and really figure everything out and then make new regulations. But they say, well, you can't do that because there's political will to make new regulations now, and there won't be in a few years. So it's a hard problem. There's no simple answer. I guess I'll leave it there.
So I just had a question about some of the medical studies you were talking about. So as I'm sure you know, there are these meta-analyses.
Right.
They compile a lot of studies.
Right.
But with this publication bias that you mentioned, where you can really only publish results where you get a p less than 5%, do you have any sense of what kind of a bias that creates sort of on a sort of holistic level?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, yeah, so first of all, you're quite right that meta-studies, which are becoming like a bigger and bigger issue, are ways to try to not just have one study and publish it, but say, let's look at all the studies that have been published, and let's try to put them all together and combine all the evidence. And it's actually a hard area, meta-analysis as it's called, because you want to take into account all the previous studies. But first of all, as you say, the previous studies might not all be published or might not all be available. It's related to what's sometimes called the file drawer problem, right? That if you could look at everybody's file drawers, you'd have a better idea of what's known about this drug than if you can just look at what's been published. And what's been published, maybe because, for example, the negative results can't be published, and there's a problem with that, or it could be because the results were not favorable to somebody or were suppressed or whatever. Those are all issues. But then also, meta-analyses, well, did they take into account the studies that were done in other languages or that used a different name for the drug? I mean, there's all sorts of issues that arise. And yeah, ideally, you want to say we want to summarize correctly all the evidence about this. And in practice, there's a lot of people working on it, and there's a lot of smart people working on it, and it's a hard problem. So to some extent, I think it's good, but it's not always a guarantee that you get everything. Okay. Oh.
Professor Rosenthal, I have two questions. The first one is trivial, and the second one's a little more important. The trivial one has to do with your book, which I read and really enjoyed, by the way.
Thank you.
Highly recommend it. You should have bought lots of copies.
I had to pay him to say that, by the way.
I noticed that the publisher has put on 2 quotations from reviewers, both of which are fairly positive. I'm just wondering how many negative ones were there?
Absolutely none, of course. No, actually, it's interesting. Yeah, first of all, that's something I have gotten before. And first of all, certainly, my publisher is just as much a part of the game as everyone else in terms of selective quotes. And in fact, the one I see you have the original hardcover edition there, so it's even more so that, as you probably know, when they first publish books, they haven't usually been reviewed yet, and so they actually get some people who are well known. They say, hey, if we send you an advanced copy, can you write a blurb? So in a way, it's even more biased because it's not even just let's look at all the reviews and select the best quotes from them. It's like, let's find some people and ask them if they can write a nice paragraph that we can put on the back. So it's true. Although, to be fair, I did get a lot of positive reviews afterwards. But
the second question, the more serious one, is about proving a negative. Now, as you know, lots of people say you can't prove a negative. Let's say there's a hypothesis that somewhere in the universe there's a purple swan with orange spots all over it. And you look and you look and you look and you never find one, but you can never prove that it doesn't exist. Is that really true? I mean, is there not some kind of probabilistic way of handling a situation like that where you reach a point where you can start to have confidence that there are no purple swans with orange polka dots?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, normally...
It comes up, of course, when you're trying to prove the existence of God.
Yeah. I mean, well, as you well know, but just to summarize for everyone else, I mean, normally studies are phrased in the form of you got the null hypothesis, then an alternative, and you're trying to see if you can reject the null hypothesis, right? So in that case, if you get enough evidence, you can say it's not the null hypothesis, but can you ever say it must be the null hypothesis is kind of a way of saying what you're thinking. Now, of course, most studies in one way or another could be turned around, so the null hypothesis becomes the alternative and so on, depending on what you're comparing it to. So there are ways to consider that. In the specific case of, does there exist purple whatever somewhere in the universe, I guess if you're saying somewhere in the universe, it's a bit hard because we don't really know how big the universe is and how much of it we've sampled and so on. But if you have some sort of finer thing, let's say on the planet Earth, right, then you can start to say, well, we've sampled lots and lots of different creatures in lots and lots of different parts of the Earth. And you can start to say, what's the chance that there is this purple whatever, but it's never been observed? And I think you can. I mean, you can't say 100% for sure that it doesn't exist, but you can say that, you know, the chance that it exists, and yet with all our searching we've never found it, could be very small. So I think, you know, you can certainly accumulate evidence that certain things are true or that certain things are false, and you can kind of match it around. So I would say, you know, it's certainly possible. Thank you.
We all know that Toyota is being really hammered in the press and by the U.S. and Canadian governments. I'm just curious, as a Toyota owner, many other car companies have been subject to recalls, a lot worse than what Toyota's been accused of. And given the fact that the U.S. government essentially owns General Motors, I just wanted your comments as a statistician, whether you feel that it's been exaggerated.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it probably has. Now, of course, I'm not an expert on specifically on cars, but yeah, first of all, it is true, as you say, that something else is being exaggerated now. But, so it's certainly true, as you say, that, you know, other manufacturers have had recalls that were at least of a somewhat similar nature, and in fact, even some of the similar problems of the accelerators and so on have sometimes occurred in other manufacturers. So, you know, there's sort of one issue is to what extent it's so much worse at Toyota. And in general with recalls, I mean, recalls are kind of an interesting issue because, of course, if one person has a problem with something, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the millions of cars should all be recalled. But then as the evidence accumulates, at some point you make that decision. And yeah, and then certainly a related issue is sort of the headline bias or whatever that, you know, for whatever reason, this Toyota recall really did catch the imagination and become really front page news and become really a widespread thing. And yeah, I mean, I think so. Again, without being an expert, I do think that, first of all, people got an exaggerated sense of to what extent there were more issues with Toyota than with other manufacturers, and also probably an exaggerated sense of the amount of risk, because there is some evidence that there's been certain problems with certain aspects of the Toyotas, but they're not that widespread. And, you know, there's millions and millions of people driving Toyotas who are fine. So yeah, I'd say pretty much it's, again, you know, just like with H1N1 and many other things, that it sort of captures the imagination, makes the headlines, and people think the situation is much more serious than it is. So I agree with you.
Okay, this is a little less of a question and a little more of a personal rant, so I'll just give you a heads up on that. Like, most of your talk is about how the general public doesn't understand probability and statistics, which I agree with absolutely. But I find also that I think the schools and universities are doing a lousy job in teaching people about it either, I mean, to a general extent. I went through the engineering science program at the University of Toronto, and my only exposure to statistics was like a first-year course, and that course was mostly you have so many white balls and so many black balls in a sack, and you pull one out. There was nothing on like real-world applications, and it really bugged me that we were never taught how to analyze, say, if you do an experiment, how do you analyze the results of it properly and get meaningful results out of that? So do you think that the university should be like doing a little more to teach people about this?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, obviously, as you might imagine, those of us in the Department of Statistics are always saying, oh, programs should have more statistics courses in them, and statistics is more important, and all those silly, you know, engineering subjects are less important, right? And I mean, yeah, I'd say generally speaking, I think that it could be emphasized more. But I mean, part of what you're saying, I think, is really not so much the universities as the pre-university education, which is a big issue. And in fact, to be fair, there is actually a fair bit more probability and statistics in the curriculum now than when I went through the Ontario curriculum. And you know, I don't know all the details, I don't work at that level, but I know, like, as early as I think the elementary school, later parts of elementary school, they're doing some basic probabilities, which we certainly didn't do. And I know in high school they've got, you know, a course in data management and those kind of things, which are, you know, giving little hints about statistical things. So there is somewhat more, and I think there is a recognition in the education system, and even in sort of the, you know, like the quantitative finance world and the headlines in the New York Times sometimes and so on. There's more and more of a recognition that probability and statistics is maybe more important than it has been treated in the past. So, I mean, certainly I agree that it should be, you know, taught more and thought about more, and that's part of the reason I wrote the book. And but also I think at least a little bit that is happening, so we can be a little bit positive about that.
That's very good to hear.
Okay.
How would you go about calculating statistical probability for reincarnation? It's something I've been struggling with for a while, since I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of friends who all of a sudden believe in it. So I'm thinking about it, and I don't know how to go about it, how to figure out, how many people have actually lived throughout the human history. So I'd like to know how you go about it.
Right. Well, I mean, you can probably guess that I'm not a big believer in reincarnation, but yeah, I guess there's with something like that, anything which, well, I'll use a bias where I'll say any sort of outlandish theory, or at least anything which is quite contrary to our experience. There's kind of two issues. One is what evidence is there from the point of view of actual people? And I know people who believe in reincarnation will say, the reason you've had trouble with your back getting sore is because in a previous life you were, evil to someone who was behind you, or whatever they'll say, right? And so those things, they tend to be sort of stretches, or at least, very hard to make the link. But then to my mind, like the reason I don't believe in reincarnation is not so much because I've figured out this person has a back problem, but in a previous life, no, they weren't evil to someone who was standing behind them. It's more, what would be the scientific mechanism for it, right? And I mean, we actually, not everyone out there realizes this, but actually we understand a lot about science these days, right? And there's a lot we don't understand too, but we understand a fair bit about, the human body and how it gets created and how it gestates and all those things. And we understand how when you die, you get buried in the ground and you decompose. And, for there'd have to be some sort of a mechanism by which something, and I guess some people would argue it's nothing physical, it's something about the soul or something, but there have to be some mechanism by which something, comes out of this dead person and somehow gets into this fetus or becomes this fetus. And to my mind, there's just, it's so contrary to everything we know about science. So to my mind, never mind whether we, believe some guy when he says, oh, the reason you got back trouble is because of your previous life, ... It's more, we understand a bit of science, and there's just nothing like that that's going on, I would say. I mean, again, we can't say for sure, and it could be there's all sorts of science mechanisms that we don't understand, but combined with the fact that there's certainly no clear evidence for it on the basis of the personalities and so on, and it's so contrary to everything we understand scientifically, for those two reasons together are why I would think of it as an outlandish and absurd theory. But again, you're not going to convince somebody who believes in reincarnation, so...
But sorry,
yeah.
Can I just
yeah.
add, could you convince them by mathematically calculating that it's not possible? Like over, say, we have almost 7 billion people on the planet now, and how would they all of a sudden, where are all these souls coming from? Okay, yeah, so that's a good point, right? That's another argument that, I've heard I forgot it just now, is that, you say, okay, well, if there's reincarnation, it's got to be kind of a one-to-one thing, right? And, you get born because you've got somebody else's soul, but as you say, there's actually more and more people, so there'd have to be a factory churning out these extra souls in order to squeeze into the fetuses that don't correspond to somebody who just died. So, that's, I guess, a whole other reason why it wouldn't work too well. So I mean, then people say, oh, well, maybe there's souls on another planet, and they get reincarnated, and they come over here, but it just becomes more and more outlandish to my mind.
Scientology.
Anyway, okay, that's okay.
Yeah, it's not my question actually, but it's follow on. Isn't there some theories that there's escalations in forms of life? So all the animals that we're wiping out, that's where all the,
I see,
that's where
right,
all the new
okay.
souls come from, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I believe it's true that, I guess I'm not sure with insects and so on, but I'll say let's say mammals, that there's actually more mammals now than there were too, right? So even if you believe, every mammal's got a soul and they can pass it on to a new fetus, and, it's possible for a rat to pass it on to a human fetus, but I don't think there's enough rats.
I don't know, it's another possibility. I guess my question, to follow on the medical theme, is there's a relatively new and unproven treatment for MS. They can get operations on the veins in the neck, and one of the problems with it is there's really not a lot of studies about this, and there's not a lot of evidence at this point. But I guess given how serious MS is and the likelihood of a bad outcome, what p-value would you need before you make the decision on saying, okay, well, how much evidence is there?
Right. Well, I mean, it is a good question, and it's related to, I think, kind of what you're saying is, often we'll say, we're scientists, so we don't want to use this new treatment until we've proven that it's correct, and we'll have controlled studies and so on, but we won't actually give it to people until we've got accumulated evidence. But there can be questions, and they're almost sort of ethical questions as to whether that's a smart thing to do. And for example, when AIDS was first getting big, and they had these cocktails, that were supposed to help to slow down or to retard the AIDS advance, and they weren't totally tested, and people said, no, we're going to do our controlled studies, but then a lot of people with AIDS or AIDS activists said, no, we don't have time for that, there's people dying, and you have to start giving it to people on an experimental basis anyway. And I do think there's some argument for that, especially for serious diseases where you say, sure, it'd be great if we only had randomized controlled trials and we didn't actually make it more widespread until we were sure that we'd proven that it works. But if people are dying today, then that can be a hard thing. And I don't have an easy answer to that. In fact, I say about that exact thing in my book. In the end, I say, so I guess I'm glad that I'm not a medical researcher, right? Because I don't actually have to make that decision. But it can be a hard decision to make. And as a scientist, I'd say, no, let's first have the controlled trials and then start using it. But, as a humanist, you can sometimes say, well, we don't have time for controlled trials. There's people dying. And certainly it applied with AIDS. And, I'm not sure it quite applies with MS, but it's not so different. So, to my mind, if someone has MS and they say, look, I've heard about this treatment, no, it hasn't been proven, and no, I didn't get into the clinical trial, whatever, but I want you to give it to me or give it to my loved one, I find it hard to say no to that, although I understand why people say no to it, but it's hard though.
I'm a big fan of what you're calling the probabilistic perspective.
Okay.
Always calculating crazy probabilities of things.
Okay.
I found it's very useful in combating a kind of fatalistic thinking that people often have, where they say, whether I try or not, I'm probably going to fail anyway. So what's the point of even trying? I find it helpful to say, well, look, if you don't try at all, the probability of succeeding is like 5%, whereas if you do try, then maybe you get up to 40%, so you're 8 times more likely to succeed. So the thought of sort of our action as increasing the likelihood of succeeding, rather than thinking in terms black and white terms of you've got to succeed or not at all. Is that something that you've thought about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree, and it's true that some people who don't think in terms of probabilities will say, as you say, sort of black or white, either you're going to succeed or not, and in fact, they'll use this in ways that I find kind of absurd and annoying. So one is, I mentioned that I get a lot of inquiries about the lottery, right? And my basic message is it's so unlikely you're going to win the lottery that unless you really find it fun, you just shouldn't bother buying a ticket. Then people say, yeah, but you can't win if you don't buy a ticket. And it's true. If you don't buy a ticket, the probability you win is 0. If you buy a ticket, the probability you win is something more than 0. It's only a tiny bit more than 0. To my mind, it's not enough more than 0 to make the difference. But it's true, it changes something from having a 0 probability to having a positive probability. And to some people, they'll kind of think that way. Either it's possible or it isn't. And so, to use your example, you might think, well, even if I don't try, there's some chance I might succeed by luck. And even if I do try, it's not for sure that I'm going to succeed. So either way, I might succeed and I might not. So why bother? And I would answer exactly as you did. Say, well, no, but if you try hard and you're smart and you make good decisions, you increase the probability, maybe by a lot, that you will succeed. And that's a worthwhile thing to do. So I think often it's very smart to take actions which, well, put it this way, when you take an action, you should think not just does it change the probability from something 0 to something positive, but how much does it increase the probability? So if it increases your chance of winning from 5% to 40%, that's worth doing. If it increases your chance of winning the lottery from 0% to 1 chance in 14 million, then in my mind, it's not worth doing. And you have to think about the numbers. You can't just think yes or no.
A bit more of a theoretical question. I recently encountered the distinction between the Bayesian versus the frequentist approach or theory, idea about probability, but I'm not sure I get it.
Yeah.
Is that something you could explain?
Yeah, I can try. I'll try a quick explanation. So what he's referring to is in statistics, you might think of statisticians as being kind of boring, right? But in fact, they're very passionate, and in particular, there's 2 sort of fundamental schools of sort of the right way to do statistical inference. And usually when I try to explain it to people, I try to explain them both, and they end up saying, yeah, but those both sound, they both kind of sound the same to me, right? And the point is they are pretty similar from the point of view of just, they both involve, we have to take the evidence and we have to use it to try to figure out what are the probabilities that this is actually showing that the drug works or whatever. But in a nutshell, the Bayesian approach is an approach where it kind of says that whenever you're uncertain about anything, that means you should have certain beliefs and certain probabilities for what's going to happen. So if you have a drug but you're not sure if the drug works, well, if you're sort of a classical or a frequentist statistician, you say, well, we don't know if it works, so we can't say anything about the probabilities until we do an experiment. If you're a Bayesian, you might say, well, I think that there's a 30% chance that this company has a drug that actually works. And that we call that your prior distribution or your prior beliefs, and that would be what you believe before you run the experiment, and then you'd run your medical trials or whatever experiment you're doing, and you'd get some new evidence from that, and then you would update your beliefs based on conditional probability, which is kind of related to the lupus test story that I gave, but this idea that you know something, but then you get some new evidence. So I guess maybe I'll go back to the lupus example quickly. So in that case, what you could think is, before I did this test for lupus, I was a healthy guy, and a little under 1% of people ever get lupus. So I'd say, well, the chance that I'm going to get lupus is something a little less than 1%. And then I get some new evidence, which in this case is a letter from the doctor telling me that the test came back positive, but about 5% of the normal population will test positive. And that's the new evidence. And then I would try to update my probabilities, whereas before I thought I had a 1% chance. Now I'd have something new, and it would work out to be about a 17% chance. Whereas if you're not a Bayesian, you'd say, well, before you did the test, you didn't know anything, and then the test sort of gave you new things. So it's a bit subtle, and I mean, really, it's more relevant from the sort of view of how you work out the mathematics. For the most part, in a typical experiment, you'll get pretty much the same conclusions, whichever approach you take. But there are people who are very passionate, and more than once in the statistics department lounge, which is a hotbed of passion, believe me, somebody would make some casual comment about Bayesian or frequentist. I was but if you're a Bayesian, how do you know what the priors are? Oh, but if you're a frequentist, you didn't do this or whatever. So some people, especially I think the sort of older generation of statisticians, are very passionate. I think maybe for the younger generation, in which I just realized I'm including myself, perhaps questionably, but we sort of heard all the arguments and we sort of used some aspects of both of it, whereas the older generation, some people were really sort of partisans for one side or the other. But anyway, there is a whole debate, so I could say more, but I'll leave it at that. So.
Jeffrey, I've got to ask, American football on 4th down, you go for it or you punt?
Interesting, right. So, yeah, the question is when you're making choices in sports, like whether, it's 4th down and you can go for it, but if you don't, if you make the first down, that's really good, but if you don't, then the other team gets a good field position, whereas if you punt, then for sure the other team gets the ball, but they hopefully get it from further back. I mean, those decisions like that come up all the time in sports, and there certainly are people who work a lot on the statistics and probabilities of sports. For the most part, the coaches would make decisions like that just kind of based on their experience and their gut and so on, but there are people who actually study the statistics of sports in a lot of detail, and they can look at statistics like, of the times when teams did go for it, when it was 4th and 1, what percentage of times did they make it? And when they did make it, what percentage of times did they go on to score? Or when they didn't make it, what percentage of times did the other team score? Versus if they punted, what percentage of times did the other team score? And you can actually work those things out, and you actually can come up with logical decisions, depending on the circumstance and so on, and depending on the past history, for when it seems like a smart or a dumb move. So people do that. Now, sports people typically are never 100% convinced by that, because they say, okay, well, maybe the statistics say we shouldn't go for it, but I feel like we can get the first down. And I don't want to argue too strongly that you should always use just the raw numbers, because in sports there are issues of how you're feeling, how your team's doing, what you think about the circumstances. But nonetheless, there certainly is a role, and there's a lot of interesting questions that people make about the statistics. And generally speaking, any question like that, you can look at the histories and see what have teams done and what percentage of times has it worked and so on. So there's a lot you can say there. But
have you ever been commissioned by a professional team?
Nothing in sports, no, I haven't done. I know some people who have, but I've never done anything like that.
Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
This event was hosted by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, an educational charity promoting science, reason, secularism, and free inquiry. CFI Canada coordinates branches and campus groups across the country, runs a public education series, provides secular community services, incorporates cutting-edge multimedia such as blogs, podcasts, and YouTube, and is a regular voice in the press presenting a secular humanist, atheist, and skeptical perspective. Visit us at www.cficanada.ca and contact us at info@cficanada.ca.